Welcome back. It is Talkin Dynasty, episode 4. I am your host, Garrett Price. I'm back with my man, Jared Wackerly. Jared, how you doing, buddy?
Pretty good, man. I'm back. I'm excited to be back and doing another show. Was at the beach for 3 weeks straight, so it was fun. But it's like
vacation guy over here.
Yeah, 3 kids under 5 at the beach, 3 different beaches, 3 straight weeks is. I don't know if you call it a vacation. It's a trip, but I feel like I need like another vacation with just the wife and I. Yeah. But it was fun, man. We made memories, but I'm happy to be back with our first guest.
That's what you need. You need a vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
I
sure.
get it. Well, we do things a little differently on this show. One of the things we're excited about is the opportunity to be able to talk about Dynasty, not just from a I like this player, I don't like this player perspective, but more the game theory, more how do we determine who we like? How do we determine who we're selling? How do we determine the guys that we want to pick in our rookie drafts? All of those kinds of things. And we want to have the opportunity to be able to bring guests on more often, especially those that might do things a little bit differently or be in a little bit different realm than we are, so we can continue learning along with you guys as you listen. So I'm very excited today to bring in our first official guest on the Talkin Dynasty podcast.
Picking up his accent.
I know, right? David Zäch. You can find him on Twitter at David Zäch 16. He is known for his fantasy Z-score, which is his rookie projection model each year, as well as the Freaks in the Spreadsheets. Great name, by the way. And that's kind of more of his weekly model that he uses each and every week. David, how's it going, man?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on as one of your first guests here. It's exciting to be talking analytics with you guys, and excited to dive into how we looked into the Nerdscore and how we incorporate film and analytics together. So it's kind of the perfect grouping here to talk through some of those things.
Absolutely. And I've said it multiple times on Twitter, but now I can say it in this arena as well. David is truly, legitimately one of the smartest guys out there in the Dynasty realm. The things that he puts together, the way he looks at the game, it's awesome, especially for some dumb jock like me that doesn't understand all the analytics and all the numbers. I really appreciate it. So, Jared, I know you have a lot of things that you've prepared that you want to discuss, that you want to ask him. So I'm going to let you take the lead here, ask him all this stuff, and then I'll just be that annoying guy that just keeps jumping in.
Yeah, so I guess just to give the listeners what our plan is for this show. My vision for the show has always been to use it as a vehicle for myself to learn and just learn from other folks that do things differently than me. Just like Garrett said earlier, there's just so many different ways people approach playing fantasy football. There's analytics, there's tape, there's a blend. Some people only do one, some people will do both. And it's fun to have different folks on that can give you that perspective. And David, I love the way that you approach what you do. And I love that you're never shy to put anything out there that may be different than what other folks are doing. I think it's really cool. So just to give everybody a framework here, like if you've never used analytics in your Dynasty fantasy football approach, like we want to start with like an intro and then a basics and how you could end up using it by the end of the show. So that's why we brought David on to go through that. So David, first question for you, what got you interested in analytics, and especially in the context of how to use it within fantasy football?
So I think I got started on how a lot of analysts get started, right? You see someone talk about something with fantasy football and you say, well, that's stupid, or I know better. So I don't know what it was 5 years ago or whatever. I was like, well, maybe I can do better. So then I started putting together my own rankings and doing my own research and building models. And I had a natural inclination towards math and building models and getting outputs and stuff like that. So I started building like that. My first year was not successful, right? You're overconfident in your process, especially right away. So I got over my skis a lot, but I did learn a lot each year that I go through and I add something different into my spreadsheets or into my process or how I look at things. So that's really helped me out in becoming a better analyst as well. And I'm always in love with creating something. I think that's one of the coolest things that we as humans can do, is to create or invent something new. So like what you guys did with the Nerdscore, like that's very unique and I think underappreciated, to be able to put a tangible number on a film grading. You know, a lot of people will say he has great hands. Well, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And you guys actually put a number to it and how it relates to fantasy points and how their career is going to shape out. And that's extremely meaningful, very hard to do. So let alone doing it and then being successful at it like you guys are is just remarkable to me. So I love learning stuff like that. And then I'm able to kind of aggregate everything I find interesting. And then I start tracking it. Like, does it actually matter? And then I start to put everything together. So that's kind of how I got started and what feeds me each year, I guess.
So what is your background exactly? Like, were you always a math guy, or do you have a background in statistics, or what?
Yep. I have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. I nearly completed a master's in psychology through an online course, and then I work as an engineer as well. So a lot of math and a theory behind a lot of those topics.
Yeah. So how would you define the word analytics for someone that plays fantasy, has heard the word, but they don't really know like what it means?
So it can be daunting to a lot of people when you just hear the word analytics. A lot of people can get scared. Like they just like, that's over my head. It's too complicated. You're making things way too difficult for me. Like all I need to do is watch a player and if he's good or not, right? Yeah. But what analytics is to me is you're applying mathematical principles to gain a usable output from a group of stats. So there's, the data that every player has from each season. You put all that data on a sheet, it means nothing if you're just looking at it, right? But if you start applying models or correlation to it, you're able to extract meaningful takeaways as far as projecting next year fantasy output from it. And my kind of favorite thing to do is put a correlation to points per game over the top of a spreadsheet. And that just kind of shows you that, okay, touchdowns are really flaky year to year and yards per game are really sticky, or target share is really sticky and stuff like that.
And when you say sticky, what does that mean?
Sorry, that it
I know what you
stays.
Mean. Everyone listening may
Jared doesn't know. Don't let him.
Just to make it clear, I know what he means.
So when I say sticky, I mean that like yards per game in 1 year translates well into the next year for yards per game. If a guy has, 70 scrimmage yards per game, that's going to be relatively close the next year, excluding all other circumstances like a team change or coaching change or injuries or what have you. Mm-hmm. Whereas a metric like touchdowns is really not sticky. That means it has a lot of variance. Like Jamal Williams this past year scoring a bazillion touchdowns. Like that's not sticky. That's probably not going to translate over to New Orleans, and you're kind of seeing that in his draft position.
Gotcha.
David,
basically can't rely on it. Sorry, go ahead, Garrett.
Right.
No, you're good. Real quick. Over the past, I mean, we've seen this trend going for a long time now, but I would say over the past few years, I feel like we've seen a lot of new metrics that are being tracked. And I feel like there's new acronyms like every other week that I'm like, I don't even know what that one means. But have you seen that trend as well? Does it seem like football in general, not just fantasy football, but football in general is getting much more advanced as far as how they're looking at the game and how they're using data and numbers to make decisions?
Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely rising fast, and kind of the beauty or drawback if done incorrectly, right, is all the new metrics that you talk about, because you can create a metric out of literally anything. Like I created yards created over expected through just purely stats. Graham Barfield does yards created, through a film thing. But I think PFF was probably one of the first people to ever do it. I mean, my knowledge base doesn't go back too far, but they were probably the first ones to start tracking usable stats, right? And building models from them. And then NFL teams got involved. and then everyone starts getting involved and everyone's doing their own thing. And then people have, coding programs like R and Python that they're able to extrapolate tons of data from and make charts out of and put any extenuating circumstances, like this is this guy's quarterback rating on third down while trailing in games in the fourth quarter and stuff like that. So there's countless things you can blend together, and that's, I'm always experimenting myself, right? It's got to mean something though. So it's one thing to just look back on data and say this is what mattered. It's another thing to have it be predictive going forward, which is a big difference that a lot of people don't realize.
And when you are trying to decide if a metric is predictive, like you're always looking at fantasy points per game, right? And if that's correct, like why?
Right. That's what I use, because injuries are unpredictable to me anyway. I know there's a lot of injury docs out there that, could say differently or help me in judging a player's injury, but points per game seems the most reasonable to me. Granted, you're going to have, half games played even out of injury and stuff like that, but it's been the most reliable source that I've used. And when you're talking about dynasty, you can look at a certain window. So you want to target a position or a player's prime window, in my experience, because you want to capture that ceiling. You don't care what they're doing at 40 years old if they're a quarterback, right? If you draft a 21-year-old quarterback, like you're looking for a prime window. So I use years like 1 through 3 for running back and years 2 through 4 or 5 for wide receivers and such like that.
So this may be a pretty simple answer, but like, why do you think analytics has continued to gain more and more traction inside the world of fantasy football?
I think it gives you just a tangible takeaway from something that you didn't always have a takeaway from. Like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of people just watch the games and they're like, all right, that guy's good. This team is good. They're going to score a lot of points, or etc. But when and the more advanced we get and the more people that do it right, the better they become, or the more robust the models are, the more accurate they are. So as things keep building up, I think people are seeing it, and then they can see that it's useful. Like I can use this in fantasy as well.
Yeah, instead of just saying like, oh, I think, that was a great run, or this guy's such a good running back because he's fast and able to break tackles, but that doesn't really give you anything tangible unless you do something like the Nerdscore, like Garret and I do, to take away. So like the numbers are something that you can look at and then compare over time. Is that
right? And to your point there, like game speed does matter. It's how much does it matter, and how much can I combine that with, a bazillion other factors to get a meaningful output out of it. So all these things do matter in some sense, or most of them do. It's how you combine them, or how much weight you give them. And when I say weight, that means like you're not judging a running back's entire career on his speed alone. Like that's worth, 5% of his projectable fantasy output. Or, just for an example, right?
Right. So that was kind of like an intro into like what analytics are, why they're being used, and why other folks listening could find it helpful. So let's get into a little bit of the basics of using them. So what are some foundational stats or metrics that, if you have an interest in using and applying analytics in your fantasy football game, like what metrics should they look into or understand, and maybe where can they find them?
Sure. So the very first thing I would suggest to anyone, getting into analytics is to just copy and paste the Pro Football Reference database. They have a fantasy tab. You can get literally every player that played football last year in one sheet. You can just highlight it, copy it, paste it into Google Sheets, and then you can write an equation on the far right side, or just find their fantasy output and put the fantasy output for each player. And then at the top row, just do correlation to points per game over each column. And that'll range from, 0 correlation to a lot for yards per game, like we mentioned earlier. So that's the first step I would do if I was, and what I did do or what I learned to do. Like, you need the correlation. Like, you need to see what matters. Otherwise, it's just going to be noise to you. It's going to be overwhelming. And that's just so simple. You can look at one column. Okay, yards per game do matter. Targets matter a little bit. Receptions matter more, etc. And then you can start getting more complex after that.
Do you know what the correlation formula is offhand?
Oh, just equals CORREL. And then
you literally use that
Yeah.
formula. Like it's a function inside of Google Sheets.
Right. Yep. And that's a very simple one. So you don't need a background in math to do this stuff. You just need to do a little searching.
You see ChatGPT, right?
Yeah,
I do that all the time.
for real.
Hey,
people do
ChatGPT,
that with
how do I do
coding.
this?
Yep.
Oh yeah, man, I use it all the time. Well, that's great. Like, what are some efficiency stats or simple like efficiency stats or regression to average statistics or anything that you could throw out there that you have found that are pretty sticky that people should look into?
So it's kind of a broad statement, and if I started talking about all of them, it would get pretty dry, right? But as I mentioned before, like yards per game is probably one of the most reliable. Fantasy points per game, of course, translates year over year pretty well. And then there's stuff like air yards per game, receptions over expected, target share, targets per game. Target share is a really good one if you're looking at wide receivers because it translates with volume. So as volume changes, like Tom Brady with the Bucks passes a lot. This year, they're not going to pass as much, but Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's target share percentage is going to remain relatively stable. So they're going to pass a lot less. Their target share remains the same. They're going to catch less balls and score less points. So, and we're seeing that as well in their values that are being reflected. But as far as efficiency stats, so I have about at least 3 models just from a single player standpoint that kind of feed into each other. And one of them's I call the efficiency model. So like yards per carry always regresses towards league average every year. So part of it's the player, part of it is regression. Touchdown rate regresses towards league average every year. And this stuff's hitting at like a 70 or 80% rate where it comes back to league average for a lot of players. And there's, a lot of other factors that we can get into later, like when you build out projections and you start looking at the team level. But at a very basic level, looking at efficiency rates like that, Rashad Penny's insane 5.0 yards per carry in his per games in limited action is, likely to regress on league average, but then you can combine in, the offensive line and scheme of the Eagles, and then it might bump it back up, but it's all a weighing game that plays together.
When you talked about yards per carry, that we're Cleveland Browns fans, and so we're not privileged in most areas, but the one area we're privileged in is we have a very good running back that always has very high yards per carry, one of the best actually ever as far as that number goes. So how do you factor in a guy like that where every year we see him have this really high yards per carry mark, but we're trying to get towards league average? Do you trust their history more than you trust the regression, or like how do you factor a guy like that seems to be more of an outlier?
Sure. And that's the exact reason I created yards created through analytics is for players like that. So he's the perfect case study for something like that. So the one model I just mentioned will expect Nick Chubb to come back towards average, but looking deeper, we can look into yards created, and he faces stacked boxes a lot. He beats expected yards per carry on those stacked boxes a lot. He has big runs a lot. So all that kind of combines together, and then he's been a top 3, yards created running back for 3 years straight. I think he owns the crown now that Derrick Henry had his down year. Nick Chubb's 3-year average just overtook him. So he's the king in my mind until proven otherwise, just like Henry was.
That's what I like to hear.
How do you factor in, like I know when you have a sticky metric, but let's say that player changes teams or they have a coaching change or a quarterback change, how do you factor those type of changes into when you're using analytics?
Okay, so this one can get pretty deep because when I build out my projections, I go team by team and we look at, I have 6 factors, I believe, that go into my team scoring. So a lot of players' value comes from their team as a whole, right? If a team's going to score a lot, the player's going to score a lot. So you can look at coaching tendencies, you can look at Vegas wins, you can look at offensive line strengths and additions and subtractions they had. Like the Titans got gutted at O-line this year, and the Eagles remain one of the top ones. So, that's a big factor in a team scoring and their rushing, and a lot of factors like that. So when you start putting everything together without getting too long-winded, I'm trying to cut myself short here without getting too far into it.
Hey,
that's what this podcast is for, man. Like people know that we're doing this show to dive deeper into topics that we don't typically get to. So you're fine.
Okay, so that's one area, and that's just the team. Like I didn't even get into the player yet. So you combine stuff like yards created, you combine career arc models, you combine the team level, you combine the available opportunity, how many touchdowns they're expected to score, their opponents throughout the year. And I also like to look at a fantasy schedule, so weeks 15 through 17. So that's always our, the money-making weeks for any fantasy football player, right? Unless you go to week 18 or something. But, all that stuff combines into my rankings. And if you're not thinking about all those things, it's easy to get tunnel vision on one stat, like Nick Chubb's yards per carry is awesome, so I want to draft him, which tends to work out, but there's a lot more factors going into it. Like the Browns are probably going to pass a little more this year, but Nick Chubb might get more receiving work. So you have to just kind of think from a very holistic high level if you want to try and capture everything and then give it the appropriate weights again.
So this is like the, if you're just starting out and you just copy and paste it into Google Sheets, you're probably not going to get to that point yet. Like how many years have you been doing this now to where you've gotten to where you are now to be able to do those type of things?
It took me 4 years to be able to build team projections that I liked. It took about 2 years to get the player models pretty good. And then my 5th year here, now I'm doing much more robust team-by-team projections that you see in the Freaks in the Spreadsheets guide that I'll update next week. And I'm also running season simulations that vary scoring game by game or overall for a player. So I give them a range, and then it ping-pongs between that range on their points per game or for a season. So that's the one I'm most excited about next, is simulating seasons. But yeah. It takes a while. So just the first step is just starting out, right? Like you get some numbers, you build a model, you see the correlation, you see what matters, you see what doesn't. And then after that, you'll start to see what you can build on your own and what takeaways you can start to make. And then it'll just keep building on each other the more you pay attention to it.
See, David, we're so much alike. As a kid, I would do the same thing. I would do season-long projections, but I would just like lay out my football cards, and it would be like, I want Eddie George to be really good. So Eddie George got 248 yards this game. And then, Randy Moss somehow had 500. I don't know how that worked, but he did. And Dante Culpepper did great with, so we're basically the same.
Yeah. Last time I simulated seasons was playing franchise mode in Madden back in the day.
I was just going to say that. Like, that's one way to simulate, right? You just plug them into Madden and let it go.
You have to get to that next draft, get the next rookie class.
I would do that on NCAA football. That was one, because I always liked the recruiting aspect so much. So I wouldn't even play.
Sim the week.
25 seasons long, and I would just be recruiting. That's all I'd do.
You sound just like my buddy. He did the same thing, and I just could not believe it. I'm like, you buy this game, and you never played a game of football on it. You just simulate the season.
I was
too. You play the big games.
I didn't know how good of a recruiter I was, because I would just always win.
Yeah, you take North Texas and you make them a powerhouse. That was the best.
Everyone does. And then you do the cheat where you create a player, but you make him a kicker. And his kicking is terrible, so he's a 1-star. But you give him like crazy speed, crazy strength, and then you recruit him to change positions to a running back. Now you got a Heisman winner.
The good old days.
Secret, folks. Anyway, back on track.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of laid out, the basics and a little bit of an intro, let's talk a little bit about pros and cons of using analytics, some pitfalls. What advantages have you found using analytics when making decisions specifically in your dynasty leagues?
So I'd say the biggest edge that I've realized personally is rookie analysis in the rookie draft. I'm able, or at least I believe I'm able, to identify rookies that will have a better career arc than the field. So a lot of people overweight landing spot, in my opinion.
Yeah, my guy.
And that lets it affect where they're drafted. So a guy will get bumped up really far, fall back really far just because of a landing spot. And how often do we see stuff change dramatically in just 1 year? Like everyone thought Geno Smith was garbage and Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf were going to be garbage because Geno was garbage. And then, they still popped off. Or a quarterback change happens and Aaron Rodgers comes to the Jets and helps support Garrett Wilson. So people overestimate, the initial landing spot a lot. And then, of course, all the other factors like the predictive metrics and then, combining film grades into my analysis too, so that I'm not left out in the cold on that one. And that's been one of the most powerful tools that I started, 3 years ago, is having a film metric that blends into all the rest of the analytic models and then combining them together. And that's been super helpful. So I've been really good at running backs. My wide receivers lately can't stop tearing ACLs and having Liz Franks, so I'm falling behind there lately. But my God, if Treylon Burks and like Rashad Bateman
Thankfully, it's just
and
a sprain
Wan'Dale
with
Robinson,
Burks.
Is it a sprain?
Yeah, it's an LCL sprain. I guess he's probably missed 2 to 6 weeks. I saw.
Okay, so he might be back for the start of season.
Maybe, right? Well, that's good.
Yeah, thankfully. But yeah.
I think it's pretty cool, David, because there was for a while, and I think a lot of people have gotten, I don't want to say smarter, but it's probably the best term to use. Like we've all grown up a little bit because for a long time it was, are you an analytics guy? Are you a film guy? And I think you were one of the ones that was doing a great job of kind of pioneering that. Look, if you're only using one, you're kind of missing the big picture. And you've done a great job with that, incorporating film watching numbers into your model. So explain, first of all, why you did that, but secondly, how you did that.
Okay, so I can't take full credit there because the first year I got onto Twitter, I was definitely on the analytics side, and the film guys didn't know anything.
You grew up. You matured.
Hey, I was on the film side, so hey.
Yeah, but
I'm happy to shake hands with you now.
The second year, well, I would just troll people that said, well, his film is great, right? I'm like, what does that mean in relation to what? Like, you're not making any sense.
You're right, though. That's exactly right. And that's why everyone should implement something like Garrett and I have, and other people like Jetpack with the FF Astronauts.
Yep.
Yeah, he does a great job. And Lance Zerline, he puts out his film grades, which I think you use too.
Yep.
Like if you are not a former professional football player, or NFL or coach, something that you can hang your hat on to say, like, I have these credentials and, I clearly, like, you could probably trust them, then you should be putting out some sort of film grade that people can reference back to see if you're actually good at what you're saying. How else are people supposed to know? Unless you've been listening to that person for a really long time, you're winning championships and all is good. But continue, please. Sorry, I just had to go on a little rant there.
No, that's exactly how I felt. Like I was so sick of it when people were telling me that. And me and Michael Liu, if you guys remember him.
Yeah.
I love Mike.
Yeah.
I was texting with him the other day.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's good stuff. But we did a study together that just obliterated PFF film grades because, well, it showed that they were almost meaningless, most years. and it was really bad. And I don't know if they've gotten better since. I've kind of stopped tracking. But that was 4 years ago. They might be really good now. So sorry, PFF. But back then, yeah, it wasn't good. There was no accountability for a lot of stuff. And when we say accountability, you know, that applies to everyone, right? You should be looking back at how your results were. But the film grades in that one were just not good at that time. And, you know, they've likely improved, you know, things get better over time. So, but yeah, using Lance Zierlein, you know, he puts a hard number to his film grades. The Nerdscore puts a hard number to it. So I track correlation to points per game, and turns out those two things in particular are really good. I found ones that are not so good, and I don't want to mention those ones, even though I just dragged PFF. But there's some that don't work, and there's some people who are good at it and understand it and are able to put it together in a meaningful way, and there are those who aren't. So we should be finding the ones who are good at it, finding a number or a rank. It doesn't have to be a number, right? It doesn't have to be 99 or 92 for a film grade. It can even be ranks on film. That's fine. But just having some sort of meaning behind the film grades or the film watching that you do, so that you can, you know, have a takeaway from it. You know, having great hands is great, but what's it mean in the big picture and stuff like that?
Yeah. And so then how do you now incorporate that? Because for somebody that, you know, until you kind of showed me how you put it all together, it didn't always make sense to me as far as, you know, you do both, but how does that work out? So explain to everybody how you utilize these film scores, what type of weight do you give to them, and then what other factors do you mesh in with those to give you your rank set for the rookie class?
Sure. So I have what is called a film grade now in the Fantasy Z score, as I'm sure you guys know, and that blends all the good film grades I've found into one metric called my film grade, or not mine, but the film grade that I've aggregated from people. So I blend them together, and what people underestimate about aggregating stuff is if it smooths out, you know, the wild outliers. So if Lance is really bad at a running back and you guys are really good at it, at least I land somewhere in the middle on their film grade. And I use Scouts Inc. as well. They've been pretty good, but they're not as good as you two.
Heck yeah.
But yeah, you blend them all together and it meshes out to one output. You just, you know, I give 40% to Lance, 40% to you guys, and 20% to Scouts is I think how I weight it right now. And that'll change over time. You know, you got to reanalyze stuff every year. But your guys started out low because it was your first year, and then it got higher and higher, and it's getting better and better. So it's really impressive seeing that kind of growth. And that's just one output. That's film grade. So for the points per game output I put for rookies, that's, you know, 20% of the picture for me. And then you got breakout age, you got dominator rating. Well, I don't use that as much anymore, but yards per route run, what conference they were playing at, the level of strength their team was, the level of strength their opponents were, how much they were able to produce at what age, and efficiency metrics in college and all that stuff. And running backs is a little different. I kind of just went through my head of wide receivers right there. But then each category has its own weight. And of course, draft capital is the biggest one. I think that carries about 25% weight in my model right now. So where they're drafted, you know, means a lot, but it's not everything. So there's and that's the other part of the edge. So with landing spot and draft capital, I suppose are the two kind of counterintuitive edges I play against.
Do you bucket for draft capital? Do you bucket like day one in its own and then day two, or do you do it by round?
I used to, but now I do an exponential per the actual draft pick. And then the grades I put out are just to be user friendly, because you guys don't want to all see a bunch of numbers, I would imagine, or that's been my theory, is I want to make it palatable for people to understand. And when someone sees an A+ for a breakout, anyone gets that. People understand it. It's a great breakout age. But if I had, 18.2 for the breakout age, they're like, okay, what does that mean? But so I like to put letter grades, even though behind the scenes it's actually just numbers all combining together.
What do you qualify as a breakout for a college receiver? Like what?
I think it's a 20% market share of yards and touchdowns on the team.
Combined.
Or 30.
Okay.
I can't remember now. It's in my database somewhere.
It's all right. And if you guys are curious to see more of the breakdown of his fantasy Z-score, it's actually on Dynasty Nerds. So he puts out a yearly article, and that you can find it on the website. But we talked a little bit of the benefits of using analytics and how you apply it in your Dynasty leagues. What about the pitfalls? What are some cons to using it, or where people could get tripped up?
So as I mentioned earlier, the overconfidence in it is a tough one that you learn very quickly. Well, if you're able to learn from your mistakes, I should say. There's people out there that are still way overconfident in their models, and there's just so much variance in the game of football, right? Like NFL GMs get it really wrong almost like half the time, right? Like they mess up on quarterback picks or players they've drafted or traded for or who they paid. So it's a very hard game. You have to account for variance and unknown circumstances to play into there. But you can still ballpark. So when I talk about projections, I'm just talking about the most likely outcome. It's more of a probability game than it is of anything of a certainty. So I'm just playing the probabilities of the most likely outcome is how I like to kind of see it.
And then how do you differentiate what a genuine insight, like an actual insight that you've gained from using data in playing Dynasty, and then how do you differentiate the noise and then insights? Like how do you differentiate the two when you're breaking everything down?
Sure. Yep. This was probably the hardest lesson I learned in those first 3 years that I was kind of diving in. I did a lot of overfitting to past data. Like I just looked at the past data. This all mattered, so it's going to matter next year, and it doesn't always do that. So now the trick I've learned, and I guess was a common practice, but I didn't know it at the time, is to blind test your models for accuracy. And what I mean by blind test is you can have a set of 5 years of data for a player, or a group of players, I should say. So like the running back position, you'll take the last 5 years or something like that. You'll build a model using 4 of those years, and then act out like the missing year is this next year and see how it did. If it's wildly different, better or worse, or if it's much worse, then you were dealing with a lot of noise and overfitting. If it's pretty similar to what you were already working with, that means you probably have a good model. And that's just one example, right, of using it. And then every year that goes by, we have another test sample, really. Sure. And one other thing I do that I should mention is you want your data to be relatively current. A lot of people go back, like 10, 20 years. It's like, what happened 10 years ago doesn't matter at all to what's happening today. So you should be truncating your data as time goes on is another thing I learned.
Okay. All right. Let me ask a very practical question from something that I know I would do. So what happens when you put in all of these inputs, all of these numbers, and you look at what it spits out and you're like, I trust the model, I feel good about it. Obviously you've been like crazy successful with it, but you look at the list and you're like, yeah, but I really want this player to be higher. Like I don't think he should actually go there. What happens when the old gut feeling is different than what the data tells you? Like, how do you reconcile that?
That's really funny because doing a gut feeling actually gave me the number one wide receiver accuracy Justin Jefferson's rookie year. So he looked good in the model, right? And so I was above consensus on him. But I live in North Dakota, so I watch the Vikings a lot. I knew he was going to the Vikings. Man, there's a lot of volume that he can just take. There's no one in his way. He can just hit right away. So I was the highest ranker on Justin Jefferson, and that was the biggest factor that led to the number one wide receiver accuracy badge that year. So it does mean something, right? But I don't have time to know the super intricate details. Like I do my best, right, with all the coaching tendencies and all these models and stuff like that. But yeah, if you have a gut feeling on something, you should go for it, in my opinion.
I love it. That makes me so happy because now that just justified what I do too often.
Oh man.
Well, I don't get crazy with it. That's for
Okay,
sure.
all right, not too many gut feelings. Just a
I
few.
know damn well Garrett's looking at the film and he's just bumping guys up in the nerd score. He's like, he's
Jared's
gotta
got
be
this
high.
guy too high. Let me
Yeah.
Jared, I
move
gotta
him down a
even
little bit.
Jared's number out.
He's slower than Jared said. So let me even it out.
Javante should have been higher than Najee.
That's true. That is still true.
Well, one question for you guys: do you hide your nerd scores from each other and then submit them at the same time so you don't influence each other?
It's funny. I've thought about that. I've thought like maybe we should do that.
We should.
Don't. We don't.
No.
I'll actually really.
Because I'll call Garrett and be like, bro, how are you this low on this guy? Like,
Talk
what
him
were
up
you
on it.
watching?
We do
Yeah, what
that
games
all
did you
the time.
watch?
Basically,
Yeah.
every time we finish up grading a player, we contact the other person like, oh, I just got done watching 6 games on this guy. he's all right. Like the hype's a little too much, but I think he'll be like a 4th or 5th round guy, like almost after every player.
That is an interesting idea, though.
Well, your guys' way sounds much more fun to be able to talk about it as you go through
gotta-
it, rather than hide it from each other the whole time you're studying all the film.
Then surprise.
Yeah, I don't know if I could ever do that because Garrett's
Right.
one of my main guys that, like, obviously that I talked through the whole rookie process with, so it'd be tough to like not share any thoughts.
It would be difficult.
No, it works for you guys, so whatever works, right?
Are there any specific positions where you think analytics provide more value over others, and why?
Yes, I do. So I had a note wrote down, but now that I've thought about it more, I think running backs are probably the most predictable, barring a starter injury and a backup comes into opportunity. So aside from that, running back are probably the most predictable in my mind. Then wide receivers are very close second because, like I said, target share is pretty stable, and you can kind of see a lot of metrics with them that are sticky. And then there's a big gap for me, and then it's tight ends. And then last of all is quarterback from a rookie standpoint. Like quarterbacks in the NFL are actually very predictable. From a rookie standpoint, rookie quarterbacks are incredibly unpredictable in my mind.
Yeah, it's the toughest position to evaluate, and it's why we don't even try to do a nerd score on quarterbacks. So much of the game is above the shoulders, and us at home talking on podcasts, sitting on our couch at our computers, like we don't have the opportunity to interview these guys or put them up on a board. We don't have access to every single all-22 game, and there's just so many factors that can go into playing the quarterback position, and it's
right.
Even the NFL like strike out all the time. So the guys with the most information. So it's like rely on draft capital. That's usually my thing.
And even then, it doesn't even hit at a 50% clip, right? Like you have Zach Wilson and Trey Lance even, and there's so many big misses on the high ends. It's just, and I've tried many times to build quarterback models. I think I did it for like 3 years straight, and I was trying to get one together. I just could never do it. It was too hard.
It's really, really difficult, and you're right. We see these guys miss all the time, and Jared alluded to it, but so much of the quarterback position is between the ears. Like there's just so much that we just can't figure out. Like if a running back is like not the sharpest tool in the shed, that's okay. Like we don't need you to be really smart. We just need you to identify a hole and run fast, man. Like we're good. But quarterback, there's so much that they got to know and figure out. But then on top of that, you have often the quarterback's looked at as the leader of the team. So you have all this extra pressure from your teammates, the coaching staff, the fans, the media, that is just different than any other position, maybe in sports. Like it's just a very weird position. So it is. It's really, really difficult to figure out which guys are going to hit and which ones aren't.
So let's get into some examples or stories that you have where applying analytics helped you make a decision that was a positive one. Like, give us a success story.
My favorite one from a team projection standpoint is my Deontay Johnson takes of the past 2 years. So I really liked him 2 years ago, but then after Big Ben left this past year, I knew the pass volume was going to go down and that was all from projections. Like, I wouldn't have probably gathered that on my own without looking through all the numbers and stuff like that. And everyone's like, oh, he's so good though. He's too good to fail. And granted, I got actually lucky on my end to fade him last year because of the 0 touchdowns. Like, that's crazy rare.
That's
but
rare.
The volume was down a good bit, and that was projectable. So I didn't draft it much. And in Dynasty, in 2 different leagues, I traded away for a first plus, and those were excellent trades. They're paying off very well right now. But so that's one, really, really good case of it that I like to talk about a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you're just continuing to build a story. We've gotten deep a few times as to like applying analytics. Like, you could do it at a very surface level yourself, or you can follow a guy like David here who puts out so much content that you could just apply and take his advice and use it with other content that you pick up on. I think like as we go, like there's been a few times where I'm like, damn, that's deep. I couldn't do that, but just listen to David and follow his, and
he knows what he's
apply
doing.
it yourself. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm wrong a lot too. Like every fantasy
that's the game, though, right?
Is wrong a good bit. It's just who can be less wrong than the next.
Yeah,
guy,
probability.
Right? The best one. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a really good analyst. If you're getting like 60 to 65% of the time you're correct, you're doing great.
That's really good.
Yes, you're doing fantastic if you're at 60 to 65%.
Yeah,
I mean, we all downplay the amount of luck that actually happens when you're playing fantasy football.
No,
I don't know if you can put an exact number on it, but
that was really funny. I was looking at some of the rankings from last year, just a couple of weeks ago, and how crazy they look in hindsight, right? Like, you look at the ADP shifts of players that have changed, and just wildly inaccurately priced people in drafts last
any
year.
ones that stick out specifically that you remember?
Well, Jared Goff, I always like to go to the Lions because I thought they looked good on paper, and everyone had them pretty low. Even Amon-Ra St. Brown was pretty attainable, if I recall right.
Yeah.
But they all, crushed expectations, right? But they were one of my team sleepers that I expected to, make the big jump. But a lot of that was from their offensive line. So that's one case that worked, right? But
Najee was way overdrafted last year, I remember. Coming off his RB3 season, and that was one of the ones I got right, so I felt good about that.
You did. You were saying to sell him, and to sell him, and now you're saying
now
to buy
him,
right?
Yeah. Then the hate's gone too far.
Oh yeah, I didn't finish the Deontay Johnson thought, but now he's a buy. By the way,
Yeah,
is what I was coming around to. So he was a buy, and he was a clear sell, and now he's a clear buy.
Why do you think he's a buy now?
The bad taste of the 0 touchdowns, the once in a lifetime, 0 touchdowns based on that many yards and targets, is going to come back up. They're going to be making a step forward most likely as a team. Their offensive line is improved. They got some more pieces on overall as the team. So I think they'll gel a little more, and he'll naturally score more touchdowns. I will go on record saying he'll score more than 0 touchdowns.
Positive regression.
That's right.
Now you talked about the Deontay Johnson story. Are there any stories that you have where analytics led you astray, or it messed you up, or it didn't paint the full picture for you?
Sure. Old slot receivers get me every time. I always fall for them. The Jamison Crowders of the world and stuff like that. They just look so good in the models, and I don't know what to do about it. Because even the age dip, like, I factor that in. Like, okay, they're going to come down a good bit. They're still valuable. They can get peppered with targets in there. But that is by far my Achilles heel. But at least I'm aware of it now, that I don't lean into it too hard. But here I am drafting Hunter Renfrow and Russell Gage at the end of my drafts all over the place. I still think Hunter Renfrow is a really good play, and Russell Gage, of course, ran into some bad luck here. But there's still some guys I like. Yep. But that's definitely been a tough one. So you have to be careful of what the model overvalues, and You just be aware of the metrics you're putting into it, because a lot of that has to do with how I build my stuff. And it's really good, for a lot of the stuff, but it's just really bad at those old slot receivers.
Cooper Kupp equal old slot receiver at this point?
I think he comes out as my wide receiver 1, but after that.
I love how in the notes you actually wrote dusty old slot receivers, not just old, dusty.
Well, I remember I was in a Twitter argument with Jacob Sanderson and Cooper Adams, and they're like, find someone that loves you like David loves dusty old slot receivers. And that stuck with me.
So in Dynasty Fantasy Football, Rich always says it on the main show. It's about who to draft, who to buy, who to sell, and maybe I'm missing another piece of that.
No, that's it. It's those three things.
Yeah.
Who to draft, who to buy, who to sell.
We've gone over how you apply it for who to draft. We've touched on it a little bit of how you use it in your trade decisions. Can you go into that a little further? Like, how do you apply analytics, and how could someone that isn't too familiar, doesn't have a really deep Google sheet like you do, like, how could they apply it?
As far as dynasty trades, you said?
Yes.
So in my dynasty trades, I base them almost solely off of a redraft lens. So I'm looking at how they're going to do this year, because regardless of their age or whatever, that's going to affect their value unless they're like super old, right? So a young, good player who I think is going to have a down season, like Deontay Johnson, I can still sell and then turn around and buy him back later. So, not everyone's going to have projections like that, but I think it's the long-term view is probably overrated in Dynasty, if I'm being frank, and how I attack it, because players' values still change year to year dramatically, and that player might be really good like Kyle Pitts, but their situation can be terrible. So it's not worth it to buy the high-end outcome of their talent in a terrible situation until you can see it coming around. And the trick is to see it before everyone else does, right? So there's things we can see coming by looking at projections, by looking at redraft. And if you get ahead of the curve, you're going to end up with a first instead of a second in some cases if you're going to sell, or a winning team versus someone that's playing a rebuild mode. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I've got of it. And that's excluding rookies, right? Because rookies in the draft, there's always what I believe to have an edge there. And that's, of course, long-term. But aside from that, players in the league, that have been there between, 2 to 5 years, I think you should play it from a redraft lens for the most part.
It's interesting. Do you have maybe a couple sells that you've identified going into this year, and maybe a couple buys that you could give people?
Oh boy, I have them in my spreadsheet. I can't think off of them right now, but let me scroll down real quick. I might. I
told Jared to ask that so that I know what players you're interested in or not for our league that we're in.
Oh,
so I had him ask that.
Yeah, I did not tell you I was going to ask you that, but
no, yeah, I got it here. It's in the bottom of my Freaks in the Spreadsheet PDF guy list.
Just since we were on it,
a whole slew of players. I'm of course very high on Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert and stuff like that. There's so many pieces with their offense that are coming together. They're adding weapons. They're bolstering the overall strength of the team. They got very strong offensive-minded coaches and coordinators coming in. So players like that I'm really high on. I don't know how many you want me to go through, but I
was just curious, some takeaways that you may be able to give people. But, follow David. Check out his Freaks in the Spreadsheets, especially if you don't do your own projections to identify these type of trade targets and whatnot. And, he'll help lead you in the right direction. As far as tools, models, and resources go, what tools or platforms do you recommend for someone starting out with using analytics?
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there, but the kind of three kings in my mind are Pro Football Reference, which I mentioned. It's just so user friendly to Excel and Google Sheets. You can just copy paste. That's how I do my data for each year. I just go into that fantasy tab and copy and paste all the positions in, and it's done in 1 minute. So I get all that, and then I start feeding all the models and data with those stats. The Sports Info Solution Data Hub is a really underrated one. They have a lot of advanced metrics that I use for the Fantasy Z-Score, and you can do free trials and get it for a week and check it out. But I tend to.
You said trials plural. Are you gaming the system?
I am gaming the system.
He's
But
Michael Scott.
Who doesn't do that? Yeah.
He has no shortage of email addresses.
That was actually hard right away. I was like, what account even lets you create email? Because a lot of them need the phone verification or the second email verification these days. So I finally found one that I can just hammer them out. So I do that. And
What is that?
AOL.com.
I think it's the Hotmail one that I use, but I can't even remember. Yeah.
Nice.
They don't require the secondary confirmation, but yeah, you can get a lot of data from there, and it's probably worth it to subscribe if you're using it all the time. So it's not completely using them, I'll say.
Yeah, we've actually talked with them about possibly powering Dynasty Nerds to do some more projects in the future. But
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
They have great stats. So like they have yards per route run for college athletes, which is a very rare stat to find, and they have that. So they have broken tackle and missed forced tackles for running backs, another very useful stat. So I like those a lot. Oh, one hidden part is Sports Reference. So that's kind of a sister company to Pro Football Reference, and that's for college. But under their one of the biggest, I guess, amplifying factors I use in the Z-Score is SRS and SOS on Sports Reference. That's referring to the team strength, like Georgia, high team strength, and SOS is strength of schedule, the teams they faced. And that means a lot. Like you scale a rookie or a college player's career to those metrics, and it just amplifies them, by 50%. It's incredible.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So right,
I mean, if they're
intuitively
playing better
sense,
versus
right?
better players, then yeah, you would think that means more.
Yeah,
Exactly,
like
and
Tajay Spears going against USC and UCF. So
USC's defense was terrible.
They were ranked.
Hey, Tajay Spears looked good in week 1
Yeah, he
preseason.
did.
I mean, he outplayed Hassan
He was
Haskins.
very good. Yeah.
That's right. RB1.
But they give you a hard number that you can scale with, and it's actually really accurate. So like it scales very well, and it's very data friendly. So that's probably the favorite one I found from Hayden Winks. I get a lot of my ideas from other people, so like I just build on them. But
I feel like that's the fantasy football community, and giving credit like you did is important. Any others that you had?
Next gen stats I use at times, but that's almost solely for my yards created through analytics. I just use their stack box rate is all.
Have you used the 33rd team's website?
No, I was overwhelmed the first time I went in there, and I haven't been back, so I should probably revisit it. You're saying?
Yeah, they've done a great job. Josh Larkley and his team over there. I use it a lot. They call it the Edge, but they pretty much give you everything Pro Football Focus does, and it's free.
Oh, nice.
They break everything down like yards per route run, and they do it by down and distance or where they lined up within the offense, and
it's
you can
free,
get
you
really
said?
deep. Yeah, it's free. So yeah,
that's worth
shout out to those guys.
Sure.
They've done a good job at building that out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. So how do you go about building and selecting your predictive models for player performance? Like, how do you go about, like, what's your process for determining, like, what you want to include, how much weight should you give it, things like that?
So it all starts with correlation. So you find a stat, it looks good. All right, it checks out as good. All right, does it predict well? And then you kind of go through the steps. And then does it overlap with anything you've already looked at? One thing we talk about in some of the other analyst groups is multi-collinearity. That's when you have two metrics that look good in their own right, but you combine them and they're overlapping too much. so that it creates noise and bad signal. So that's one thing you just have to just kind of be aware of. And it's easy to test for if you do an analysis pack on a group of data. So it can build out like a regression model, a linear regression model for you, and it'll give you p-values. So for those who aren't familiar with p-values, it's just how reliable or how meaningful that metric is to the output of your data set. So you combine a bunch of different metrics, put them in this analysis, and it'll tell you. So that's one way to check for it. And
is that different than an R-squared value?
Yep. So R-squared is basically correlation, but times itself. So R-squared you can kind of take as meaning how much weight you can give a metric is what I use it as. And sometimes it's exactly the R-squared. Sometimes it's just something really close or a scaling factor of that. But a p-value is how meaningful that is in that particular group of data you selected to the output, and does it overlap with other metrics that you're putting together. So when you create metrics, it's really important to do something like that.
So can you give me an example of what that would look like? Because from the way I'm understanding it, it kind of reminds me, and I could be wrong, but one of the it's awesome and people reference it all the time, but like the relative athletic score, but one of the criticisms I've seen is like it factors heavily on speed because it's looking at the 10-yard split, 20-yard split, 40-yard split, and then they all go in there. So it's like more weighted on speed than other things. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about where it'll create noise and it overvalues certain areas, or am I missing what you mean by that?
Multicollinearity.
Multicollinearity. Yep.
Spell it, Garrett.
I don't even know if I get the first three letters right.
It just means two things are overlapping, and you don't want that in regression analysis. So when you say the relative athletic score, that's not, well, I guess when you use the 10, 20, and the 40 together, then that would be. Like if you're building a model using all three of those, they're going to be overlapping. I mean, they're part of each other. They're built into each other. So if you build...
So double counting.
Yes.
Stats.
Sorry, that's the best way to say it.
Okay.
Yep.
Makes sense. All right. Just clean it up.
Now spell it, Garrett.
I don't even know if I can say it, let alone spell it.
It's a tough word to say. I don't even like saying it.
And then are there any books or courses, other resources you recommend for people to learn more about how to put these models together, or analytics itself, and applying it to fantasy football?
Sure. So the most I've learned is seeing other people do it. So when you go into someone else's database or you hear someone else explain through it, that helps me the most, because it's hard to know exactly what they're thinking in their database without them kind of telling you. So if you see any kind of YouTube video, or just searching Google for a lot of these words that I've used, if you don't know what they mean, just Google them. There's so much info that's free out there, and you can learn it very quickly. All you just got to pay attention to it and just kind of concentrate on it, and it'll start coming pretty naturally. It's tough getting over that first hurdle, but then things will kind of come together. The most I learned right away was from Peter Howard's database. He does all his stuff.
I love Peter.
Yeah, he's got
such a good guy.
He is very helpful. Just very
He's one of the
selfless.
first guys that helped me in this industry when I was working for Addison Hayes and his company ffstatistics.com back in the day. Man, that was my first gig. But yeah, Peter's great.
Yep. That's funny. He was one of the very first people who helped me too. Like I created a Twitter account. I didn't even know what Twitter hardly was, 5 years ago, and I reached out to him and he answered me. So that's always meant a lot. Him and Hayden Winks both reached back to me, and that means a lot to this day, because I don't think I would have actually kept going without their support and advice. So that means a lot from them. But yeah, he's got a great database and a Patreon that if you want to go deeper into it. But he actually shares his exact models and equations that he uses for all of his outputs. So like, don't copy him obviously, but just look through there and see how he's doing it and how he weighs stuff, because he's very good at it. He knows what he's doing. You just have to follow the steps along. So on one of his tabs on the bottom, you'll be able to see all his equations at the end. So just click inside that equation and look through the cells it's referencing and how he's building that. And that taught me a lot just starting out. So once you get a database, or if you are diving in, that's a great resource. And then, like I said, just listening to tutorials or other people who are analytic orientated kind of explain it. I'm probably one of the most, I guess, transparent as far as article form in explaining my process. Like, I don't hide a thing. Like you can see in the Fantasy Z-score, I explain everything I'm doing apart from the weights that I give everything. And there's other people that go into that kind of depth too, but I kind of pride myself on being open, like you guys said, being transparent with the process. So you guys are like that too. And I think that's extremely valuable if someone's going to learn from you, which is what I like to do. So
yeah, I've shared the Nerdscore sheet with a few people before that were interested in kind of doing their own thing, because I would like to see more people in the industry implement a film grade if they're if that's their thing, so happy to help folks create their own.
Or reach out. Reach out to one of us or someone that you admire, and chances are they will get back to you. Like I said, I was a nobody, and I reached out to Peter, who's a bigger account, right? Like, it can be a little intimidating. Just be polite and respectful and just honest. Ask them for help, and they'll guide you. Like, unless someone's just a complete asshole, like we'll help you out. So,
right. Yeah, I will say there's been times where I just haven't got back to people, and I feel bad, but sometimes like life, guy. I'm not an asshole, but
there is a lot going on in life.
I have 3 kids under 5. I do a lot for Dynasty Nerds. I have a full-time job. It's like everybody's got things going on. So, and it's never intentional.
Like everybody has them and they all stink.
Let's get into a little bit of like integrating analytics. And I think we can, let's go into a little bit of the Nerdscore, because every year, and I really appreciate you doing this, you kind of evaluate how Garret and I did, where can we improve, and just the overall study itself, like how it's doing. So could you go into that a little bit and talk about how our Nerdscore that we do?
Sure. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, I track all the film grades that I think are meaningful. And as I mentioned with the Nerdscore, I started out low because it was its first year, and then I've bumped it, each consecutive year after that, because it keeps getting better and better. So I put that next to, the other ones and see how it's doing. And then an easy way to kind of visualize how well it's actually doing is just build a scatter plot of the grades versus points per game. Like, that's a really simple way to see how good something is. And, I'm looking at it right now, the correlation to point per game on wide receivers right now. NFL.com has a correlation of 0.49. Dynasty Nerdscore has a correlation of 0.44. And Scouts Inc. has a correlation of 0.44. And that was over, what is it for you guys? Is that 3 years or 4 years of data now?
That was our third year, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we just the first one 4. I have is CeeDee Lamb. So that class was 2020.
Yeah. And that was our first year, similar to how you talked about your first year. Our first year was definitely our worst. I don't know the best way to put it. It was our worst year. It was, we did fine at running backs, but specifically receivers. We learned a lot of lessons that year on how
was that Jalen Reagor and like Denzel Mims?
Jalen Reagor, Chase Claypool.
Yeah. But he's coming back now. It's getting better.
Yeah, he is.
Right, because he scored so many touchdowns first year.
Yeah, that really threw a wrench in it.
Yeah, but all of those, Denzel Mims, all of those guys. So it was a huge
Justin Jefferson
wide receiver class. And, we had a lot that we were still learning and figuring out. In retrospect, maybe year one, we should have just done it on our own and not publicized it year one and just see how we would do. But we've always been big about being transparent and like
do it live.
We'll do it live, baby. We'll do it live. But yeah, we've seen it. We've seen it improve drastically over these past couple years.
Yeah, and it has, and I have the data back that up if you're ever wondering. So
Hey.
Please share.
yeah. Okay, so that's, just one high level looking at the top of, how they're doing compared to the field, if you guys are interested in learning more about the Nerdscore or other film grades. But then I went in and Jared and Garret were kind enough to share all their categories and scores within that. So I kind of broke down what categories, are the most meaningful in their nerd scores. And there were some interesting takeaways in what they were both really good at, or what really mattered, and things that didn't matter so much or were noisy that created bad signal in the overall score. So for their running backs, patience, break tackle, and physicality were extremely meaningful on both of their scores, and were above average grade for correlation to point per game. And ironically, as Garret mentioned earlier, game speed was actually a 0. It had no correlation to success so far as running backs go, which is kind of counterintuitive to how we think of a lot of things. So like, a guy's fast, he's going to score a lot of points, and I would have agreed with that. Like, that's not something I would have realized, but there might be something different in that particular category that we can improve, whether it's, their short area speed instead of, something like that. But I guess you guys got burst and acceleration on there too. But it's funny, the similar takeaways. And you guys mentioned that you do kind of talk together about your scores. So maybe there's a little bit of influencing of each other a little bit. But it's really impressive how well you guys were able to come together on a lot of these categories and do really well at. So I thought that was really interesting.
I wonder if the specific classes too, because we're still at a decently small sample size, only 3 years.
That's true as well. Yeah.
The specific classes have anything to do with it. Because you look at the top backs from each of the past few classes, like Jonathan Taylor was one of the best from his class, power back. Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, power back. Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, more so on the side of power than like lightning fast necessarily. So I wonder how much the classes play into it. And obviously this year we've got a big power back as the top guy in Bijan, but the number 2 guy is much more so of a speed back. So it'll be interesting to see how those numbers play out over the next couple of years.
For sure.
Yeah, and I love hearing those takeaways, and off the air, I think we should get on a call and maybe figure out how we may even adjust some of the weights that we give some of these categories to further iterate on our current score and how we can make it even more predictable.
I did see your weights were very overall in line with how the scoring was. So the weights you already had in there were emphasizing mostly the right things already. So it seems like you already had a good feel for how your scores were behaving.
That's good to hear.
and that's probably why they score well, because you probably gave a little less weight to some of the ones that are a little more noisy, and more weight to the ones that are sticky. So props to you for identifying that right off the bat.
We haven't changed the weights since we started yet, because we wanted to get a few years under our belt first, before we go and start tweaking anything. So,
okay,
I'm still trying to figure out how exactly, if we were to tweak anything, how we would go back and maybe apply it to the previous classes. I don't know how we would do that on the website, because I'd still like to have just like, here were our numbers, this is what it was, but we have changed them going forward, and these are the changes. I don't know, something, but
yep. No, and like I said, a good kind of practice one would be, if we, weighted everything exactly off of correlation to point per game, which, sometimes you can do, sometimes you can't. But then, blindly taking a class out, creating our model from the last 2 years and then back applying it to that first year, since the first year was the first year that you were kind of experimenting, and kind of see how it did if you applied backwards from a blind study like that. But I'm thinking out loud, but.
We have started to throw around the idea of creating like separate metrics from the Nerdscore grades, that we like a separation score that's built strictly on like agility, route running, release.
Okay, that'd be interesting.
Those type of things. Yeah.
And we even you mentioned the correlation that has seemed to be pretty successful at running back was one that we were kind of wanting to do too, call it like a B score or something like that, which would be like power, broken tackle, like things like that, kind of all coming together. So it would be interesting to see how those numbers would look if we kind of removed those specific attributes.
Definitely.
You went through a few of the running back ones. Do you have any for the receivers?
Yeah, the ones that you guys both were number one in was body control for wide receiver. That was the number one predictor of fantasy points.
That's interesting.
Which blew my mind, right? Like,
yeah,
body control is that important for a wide receiver. I would have never guessed that in, a million years, right? If that's the number one. I would have said route running or something like that would probably be my number one, just off the whim. I'm not a film guy, right? But to have body control as the number one and a strong number one for both of you is remarkable. So I don't know what that.
When you think about it, like, I mean, most of the top guys that I feel like we've graded, and you look across the league, typically have really good body control. Like Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb,
right,
Justin Jefferson, like all those guys are able to contort. Garrett Wilson,
and going further, being able to identify it well, like you did, is equally part of it. So someone else might see body control in a different light than you guys do. You guys apparently, see it extremely well. So I would keep leaning into that. I don't know. There's no notes on that. You guys are doing extremely well.
What about the ones where it's like, this one didn't really mean much of anything?
Game speed was down there again. And physicality was absolutely nothing to correlation to points per game.
Okay.
Which is interesting.
Which seems like it could be part of body control a little bit. I don't know, I guess. But like if you're fighting for the ball, would that be part of physicality, pushing someone away as you're adjusting yourself? But I don't know. I'm talking about my ass. I don't know what I'm talking about with film.
No, that's all right. Like body control, I look at more at like the athleticism side of being able to contort your body in different ways in order to catch the football or keep your feet in bounds or, different things. It's
just Justin Jefferson one-handed catch on fourth down.
Exactly. And I see it almost, not necessarily, but it's half of like ball skills, half of that is catching the ball, actually the physical ability to catch the football. But the other half is what your body is doing to prepare itself to catch the football, and so you see guys that have really good ball skills are a lot of the top players in the league. And so I think body control is half of what you get from players with good ball skills.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating to me. I don't know. That's a good clip segment, I would say, right there.
I'm wondering
Peter, clip it.
Like the game speed thing, like they say, like when you get to the NFL, the game's so much faster, and we see it all the time. Like quarterbacks that are decent runners in college does not translate to the NFL because DNs are running 4.4s and everyone on the field is fast. So I wonder if maybe that college game speed that we see just doesn't translate as much to the NFL because, everyone's pretty much on an equal playing field. There's definitely, like, guys that are super fast, but still, like, it doesn't make as much of a difference in the NFL game as it does in the college game. I wonder if that just a thought light bulb that came up as you were going through that.
No, that makes sense. Oh, and I did give these guys a disclaimer to not take anything from the study to heart because their nerd score is very good. And sometimes when people hear critiques about certain areas, they adjust their way of thinking in a negative way. I don't think these guys will do that. And I, of course, I like warning people that seeing bad or whatever little parts of something that might be considered bad can affect people. But these guys are smarter than that, so they won't let it get them down.
Give too much credit.
So, now going further, the future of analytics and using it in Dynasty Fantasy Football, where do you see the role of analytics evolving to over the next 5 to 10 years within the game?
Let's see. Well, we kind of talked about it earlier and how, everyone's kind of getting more into it and more things are becoming available and more access to it, and people are analyzing more with it, building all together with it. So I think it's, there's got to be a limit on something, right? But there's just so much you can do with a pool of numbers that seems meaningless at the time, but it's until someone finds a meaningful pull from it. So I always think there's going to be some kind of discoveries, whether they're micro discoveries or whatever, that'll be happening. So I do like that, and I do think iron sharpens iron in that, the more you see out there, the more you'll learn from it, and then newcomers come in, they see things differently, and then that keeps adjusting the game.
Are there any emerging metrics or methods, or what about using tracking data? I feel like that's pretty big these days, like the miles per hour things we're seeing. Have you played around with any of that? Like, where do you see that going, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we just talked about how game speed was overrated, so not that one. But no, just kidding.
Hey,
Fair point.
I'm just kidding. But like open score, I saw people start doing some stuff with that seems promising, and they say that.
What's open score?
So I forget who makes it, but I think Tej Analytics, Tej Seth, I think his name is. Do you guys know him?
Like a score for receivers getting open?
Yep.
Or is it like a company name?
No, it's measuring how often a receiver gets open regardless if they throw the ball to him, if I remember right. I haven't dug into it too much
using
myself.
Player tracking, like.
Yep, I believe so. I don't know if they do film and then, like measure it on the screen, like how much they're open or what,
Sure,
or
like
if
a yard
it's
and a half of separation or something like that.
Right.
Open, or?
I know Next Gen Stats have their separation stat, but that's only, I believe, on receptions. And of course, if you're getting thrown to, you're probably open. So I know people have debunked a lot of noise in that not being sticky, but open score seems different in that it seems more reliable so far, and that it tracks year to year, whereas that yards of separation at catch point didn't. And I think they said it was predictive of fantasy points, but I have it in my notes to kind of dig into to see if it's meaningful. But that's kind of what I mean by like being aware of new stuff that's coming out. People are always seeing things differently or doing different stuff with player tracking, or even tape studies. Like that could be a tape study metric, right? You could be watching a player through his snaps, and then when he makes his break and gets open, you could see if he gets open or not, or if he's sluggish out of him, etc., and then put a number to that, which is part of what you guys are doing with the Nerdscore too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always wonder when I see the miles per hour stuff come up, like, is it reliable? Like, how are they doing that? Does it mean anything? Because it's cool to see. Like,
it's very fun. But
Malik Neighbors for LSU, I saw in Bruce Feldman put out his freaks list, his annual freaks list. I think he said he had like 22.9 miles per hour, which is crazy. I'm just curious.
Did you see what reportedly Jalen Hyatt had over 24 miles an hour at Jets camp this year?
I was just going to mention that.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah,
and he did it multiple times. It wasn't once. It was like 3 times, right? That they measured him above that?
Something like that, yeah.
It was so fast.
It is.
It's crazy.
What was DK Metcalf's when he chased that dude down?
23 something, I thought.
Okay.
Buda Baker.
Buda Baker, yeah, that was crazy.
We were watching that game together, Jared. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Sorting football cards.
Oh, that thing created so many memes
cool.
from it. That was really funny.
I did.
Yeah, that was crazy. Well, David, we really appreciate you joining us and having the special honors of being our first guest. Yeah. This was a super interesting conversation, and it's one I think that could just serve as evergreen content. I mean, if you're interested in analytics and learning anything about applying it to Dynasty fantasy football itself, like, just put this show on, take it back, get a pen and paper out or whatever you use to take your notes, and take some notes. And do you mind people shooting you DMs, asking you questions?
Yeah, I don't have my DMs open to everyone, but I do answer comments most of the time. It's just, keep your questions, pretty straightforward. Like, don't ask for an entire process on how to build projections in a comment on a tweet. Like, I have a lot of that in Freaks in the Spreadsheets. Like, if you want to learn that,
your
PDF. Yep, go read through that. That explains a lot of the process. So just if you want to ask like specific details, just do a little read through first, and then I'd be glad to bounce anything off of you. So
I feel like that's like Reddit. What's the word for it? Like, give me the word, Garrett. Like, what's the etiquette?
Etiquette.
Damn, I hate when my brain just can't find a word.
So give me the word. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Or like that's like etiquette 101.
Yeah.
I mean, don't ask someone a question that's inside their content. Like, do your own research and YouTube things, and then of course, then reach out. And
to be clear, I'm not saying you need to know all of it or understand all of it. Just try to go through it. Just meet us halfway, right? Like, just so that I know you've attempted to make a little bit of an understanding, and then we can go back and forth. So,
well, David, I genuinely appreciate you coming on. I know, this is a longer show, and I know it's a lot to talk about and a lot of information to process, but we've talked about the Z-score, and we've talked about the freak in the spreadsheets. I almost said that wrong. Freaks in the spreadsheets. But is there anything else that you want to promote? Anything else you want to plug? Anything else you're doing that you want the people to know about?
No, I'd like to plug your guys' Nerdscore. What you guys are doing, like I said in the beginning, is pretty remarkable. So, and I really appreciate you guys having me. I've looked up to you guys for a long time, and now to be kind of working alongside you is a blessing. So thank you guys for having me.
For sure, man. We think highly
appreciate
of
that.
We think very highly.
Likewise. I wish I could do what you do with all the data that you have and the projections and everything. Like, ask Garrett. Like, I've tried to teach myself Python. Like, I know some things, but I can never put it all together to put my own projection model together and stuff. So I'm working on it. I'm trying.
There's people out there that do all that stuff. I tried as well, and I couldn't do it. I just can't wrap my head around it. And like, I understand data in Excel and how to use it and manipulate it. It's when I get into Python, I feel like I'm missing something when I pull a data set. Like, I didn't see it or touch it. Like, I don't know if it's a real point that I should be using or not. Like, all the other ones, I know it's real. I know it's that player's stat, and I can see it. But
I'm just happy when I get a formula correct and I'm like, oh, it worked. Yes, this is great.
I saw your dispersal draft Google sheet you put together. I was like,
pretty decent,
I'm so
right?
proud of him. Yeah, it had drop down list that got rid of the player from the list when they took him. I was like, wow.
Moving up in the world, guys. Moving up in the world. All right. Yeah. Well, that wraps up the Talkin Dynasty show. Once again, if you're interested in analytics or just following somebody that is really smart and good at fantasy football, follow David Zäch 16 at David Zäch 16 on Twitter for all of his content. Jared and I will be back in 2 weeks. I don't know what we're covering yet, but we're going to do a deep dive into something, and it's going to be fantastic. So don't miss it, and we will see you then.
And one last thing.
Go ahead.
We'd sent the Devy League invites out. Well, Garrett did. It took him forever, but he finally got him out.
And the guy was on a 3-week vacation.
The people have been selected, so if you weren't selected, I'm sorry, but we really appreciate you guys leaving all those reviews. If you could, and if you enjoyed the show, leave us a 5-star review. Again, it helps us out a ton.
For sure.
Check out dynastynerds.com. Check out the Nerdscore. Check out David's Fantasy Z-score articles that he puts out on dynastynerds.com. We love you guys. Appreciate it. Take care.
See you in 2 weeks.